Two, one. Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is March 15th, 2022, the Ides of March. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast called I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Francis Shor. Francis, where in the heck are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Royal Oak, Michigan, just a little suburb that's right to the north of Detroit.
How cool is that? And do you prefer me to call you Francis or Fran?
Fran, actually.
Great.
And it's interesting because I have several of my books are Francis and other books are Fran. So I keep people guessing that way.
Hey, that's a good way to do it. So the first question's easy. What's the best thing for a human being?
What's the best thing for a human being?
Yeah.
I think love and solidarity.
Oh, I love both of those. I get love all the time, but I don't get solidarity too much, and I appreciate that a lot. We need that immediately. What's your favorite form of information, Fran? How it comes into you?
You know, I am so old school that I love sitting down with books and
Yeah.
reading books.
Yeah, me too. So did you grow up a reader mainly? I know it's probably a combo, but mainly because your parents were telling you to read, they did it as an example or on your own?
No, both my parents worked and were very busy. And in fact, I hardly ever saw them read anything. So as far as an inspiration, that it didn't come from them. I think probably as a consequence of growing up in a particular era in the 50s, a lot of emphasis in the school that I went to on reading. And my peers, of course, were also people who liked to read.
How cool. And so, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I think, that's our primary way of rendering our culture. Of course, we've transformed how that occurs from oral to written to, electronic. But I think the transmission of culture via the written word was an important element in how civilization developed.
Fran, you're concise, articulate, and you really get what I'm after. These two words you use before the word culture, render and transmission. Suss that out a little more. What does that mean?
It really,
Render culture.
yeah. I think part of it is when we develop particular kinds of modes of living and modes of consciousness. Those are things which we want to hand down in some form or another. We can pass those orally, or we can pass those through other kinds of communication. And that means of communication is very important because if we're doing it orally, it has a finite moment. You can keep it on tape, obviously, but still, if, however, it's committed to a written form, it can then outlast us.
Dude,
You know,
you're nailing everything we study because we're doing live TV right now. We're not in the 50s in New York with big clunky cameras and Elia Kazan directing. This is an
right?
amazing moment. So, we got spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. That's pretty much the whole baby in the bathwater. So, is this need, Fran, to gather or collect information more innate in humans or more invented by humans?
No, I think it's a combination. I think, we certainly have deep structures that allow us to formulate language, but that the formulation then of that language takes place within a particular context. And it's within that context then we begin to figure out how it is as beings that we're whether it's Homo sapiens or the kind of people that we are, that we can create something that then gets put down on some form, whether it's initially through pictographs, ideograms, or eventually a language that we then use to construct words, etc.
Very good. Do thoughts create emotions?
Again, I think they certainly can. I think as much that particular reception of images can also obviously create emotions. So that if you see something that you have a phobia to, you're immediately going to go into some sort of flight or fight response, which is a biochemical reaction in your body. So yeah, definitely thoughts, images are, I think, even more powerful in striking at our emotional, visceral core.
Can humans think without language?
That's a really good one. I think I think there is a suggestion, and again, this is my primitive sense of how anthropologists would think through this. You need some formulation. You need some way of considering what a thought means when it's rendered as a word. But those thoughts can come through without the language being fully constructed.
Yeah. Amazing. Is thinking more innate or more invented?
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by inking.
Thinking.
Oh, thinking. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That's my
that's right.
headphones.
Yeah,
My
that's all right.
headphones. Is thinking?
Is thinking more innate or more invented?
Um, I think that, again, there are ways in which language is structured, deep, deep structures that allow us to build some formulation, some thought. And so I think it's a combination again. Some innate characteristics provide the building blocks for constructing that thinking.
I don't know what I think until I fill in the blank.
I don't know. I don't know what I think until I act on it.
Act on it. That's very good. McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it.
Yeah.
Well, I know you're an activist. That's beautiful. Chomsky says that a language is not just words. It's a culture, it's a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language breaks down? When language doesn't work, what do you do?
Okay. Me personally, when language doesn't work.
Yeah. What's a strategy?
Let me give you an example from when I was teaching. And this will be maybe a little bit longer than you'd like. In
That's
any
all right.
case, yeah. So I was teaching a very difficult concept. I was teaching. I was trying to get at Foucault, the French philosopher's theory of power, and power. For Foucault, operates in circular form. It's not the pyramid that most people think. So I had people who had read an excerpt draw a graph of how they imagined his notion of power operated, and most of them were able to come up with a circuit. This is what a circuit looks like. This is what resistance in that circuit means, that you prevent power from continuing its circuit because you, as a resistor, insert some form that's not a conduit, like a block of wood in some kind of electrical circuit. So I think that what happens is sometimes people have to be able to see graphic images that help to further elaborate a particular concept.
That is beautiful. What do you do when language breaks down? Use graphic imagery. How easy? That's pretty good. So
well, here's the other thing about that, Jerry, is of course language is deliberately manipulated in ways so that it presents a false picture. I mean, this is what happens with propaganda. This is what can happen with that certainly going back to Orwell was concerned with, that you could make the word peace or make the word any number of words conform to a propagandistic object or objective.
You know, this quote by Jacques Ellul is loved by McLuhan, and it entails a bunch of words that we've discussed so far. And I'd love to hear your reaction to it. Propaganda is just culture in action. Any comment?
I think that's a little overdetermined. In other words, certain kinds of political cultures take their objective as manipulating people's thoughts. That is what propaganda is. It requires a manipulation of people's thoughts and also playing to certain kinds of emotions. That's what demagogues do, right? They figure out what can move people viscerally or emotionally, and then skew it for their own ends. So it's not just the general culture, that is a propaganda. It's the way in which that kind of culture can be manipulated.
Hold on one sec.
Sure.
In the turmoil of our tech problems, I forgot to turn my phone off. So bingo, I had to do that. This is good, Fran, because, in my McLuhan studies, we sort of catch on these phrases, and I love someone learned like you to explain. It was said, I don't know if he said it, but that Europe doesn't demonize culture. America demonizes culture. So, not culture. America demonizes propaganda, and maybe Europe and other cultures don't demonize it so much. And just in sussing that out, isn't me and you handing out flyers for an anti-war march propaganda as much as the government controlling the New York Times as a means to promote war?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously when we want to move people to take a particular political position, we utilize all of the linguistic resources we can come up with that are tap into some kind of response. So I think that obviously the mainstream media, the government, the state, they have particular mechanisms that they utilize in order to promote a particular perspective. And, we as an oppositional culture, let's say, as dissenting citizens, we look for ways in which we can provide an alternate perspective and one that challenges the dominant ideology.
Yeah, we're going to get into this. This is great because it's like we started using mimeograph machines.
Yeah. Do I remember that? Absolutely.
I know
in fact, in the novel that I wrote, part of the setup for this draft resistance movement was to make sure the mimeograph machine was working.
Yellow.
And to get, so that we could mimeo our flyers. And most people, most of the younger generation has no sense of what that was.
Yeah. And then, the great ratio is I've given out flyers all my life for 50 years, and I still do. And it's like you got to give out 100 flyers for one to work.
Yeah,
So,
that's usually the case.
yeah, talk about killing trees. But anyways, we're going to get into that in a few more questions first. Your observations of humans in general, I know it's both. Are humans more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
I think that what happens in most cases, um, for those of us who have like to believe we have some kind of emotional intelligence, is we can find a way to be reflective of those feelings and translate those into some kind of thinking that aids us in better understanding who we are at any particular moment.
So well put, man. You're a magician. You're a wordsmith. Two questions from Alan Turing, 1950. Is
Uh,
thinking a function of the soul?
that's a slippery concept, the soul. Certainly, a guy like Turing, who was working with machines, wouldn't try to reduce everything to just machine, to the binaries, right? Um, uh, but I think there's obviously debate about thinking through how the brain functions. Um, does it operate as a kind of glorious machine, or does it have in its in its construction, does it have a factor involved which allows for something beyond just a reductionist mechanistic view of the world? So I think, yeah, we tap into something other than just simple stimulus response. We try to become much more reflective and try to think through the ways in which our thinking combines emotional resonances and also intellectual thinking.
Beautiful. And the second Turing question is, can machines think?
Obviously, with certain basic functions, and we know that was it Big Blue that beat the
Yeah.
chess master. Well, so in terms of being able to figure out mathematical formulations and looking at a whole sequence of possible moves in chess, that they can certainly a machine can certainly do that. It's the ability of adding some twist and maybe reconfiguring at a moment that allows humans to be something more than machines.
Beautiful. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
It used to be, this was an argument that my first wife and I had. And I came down on the side of, that the primary function of a human being was not just to pursue happiness, but it was try to find some way in which you construct meaning in a world, and meaning in a world that puts it within the context of a community. So I mean, I'm not a. There are times when I'm obviously give myself over to hedonism, over to happiness and pleasure, and I think we wouldn't be fully human if we couldn't do that. But to reduce everything to merely that makes us at times lacking in the kind of solidarity that we need with people who are in pain and suffering.
Wow. Fran, there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but that one you got right. Bravo. Yeah. So, does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? And again, this is just your hunch. I know some of these are like neuroscientific or anthropological.
They certainly are. Had I known we were going to get into this, I would have gone back and read more Oliver Sacks.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. That's beautiful. LSD right here in Venice Beach. But I'm just saying, just to, because like Lily Tomlin, another Michigander, said
Yes, it's a
reality.
collective hunch.
Yeah,
Collective reality is a collective hunch.
hunch. It's great. So does the brain more, and again, it's just your hunch. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
Oh boy, that's a hard one. That's going to send me back to doing some reading. Um, I I think that we, as conscious beings, we tap into things again that pre-exist um, a conscious, reflective world, and it's like in a gestalt, a little gestalt project, right? You're put into an environment, and as you know, the brain also likes to complete gaps, and it does that because there's something about how the brain operates that requires symmetry, that requires some kind of connection. So in that sense, we're creating forms of consciousness, but they are pre-logical.
Yeah.
Right? They, in that sense.
That is beautiful. And so what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
In some cases, as I get older, definitely the speed of light.
Dude, I love how you laugh after I interviewed George Carlin's daughter, and she would laugh, take a deep breath, and then answer the question. So I love laughing. That's what we're really all about. We're not taking. Audre Lorde says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rayner responded, said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest or gravitate towards?
Wow.
And don't be thrown off by the word new.
No. I love that quote from Audre Lorde.
Yeah.
And I think it's particularly true when you consider violence. Which is a tool that every state, and as we're now seeing, that certainly Russia is deploying to really tragic consequences in the UK, in Ukraine. So, but it's also the case that the internet is a place where people can circulate ideas which are subversive, circulate thoughts which can't be controlled. And even though, it operates still as an instrument for warfare and for imposing control on people, it can become an instrument that that can help dismantle the master's house.
Yeah. Friend, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Oh, geez, what don't I worry about? I mean, this is part of growing up Jewish, right? I mean, it's just, there are obviously people who, and I haven't gotten into this habit, who try to clear their mind, who try to do some kind of meditation so that you don't have these thoughts bubbling up. And, I try to stay away from things that I know are going to disturb me right before I go to bed, but it's hard to resist not seeing what the latest news is, for example. And then that in turn triggers all kinds of thoughts. That's the problem. I don't just worry about one thing. If there was one thing I could worry about, and obsess on that one thing, I'd be happier.
But Fran, what's the difference? Because my mom, we sort of connected through my sister Janice Fialka and her husband Rich Feldman and the great Bill Myers. And at my mom's funeral service, I said, there's a lot of people in this room that worried that Dolores worried too much. So, and then I went into this rap as like, there's a fine line between worry and concern, because I think
Yes,
my mom was just concerned. So that's the
that's
question. What's the difference, just basically, between worry and concern? I mean, aren't they just really closely connected?
I think they are very closely connected. I worry about my granddaughters, the kind of world they're having to deal with now, with COVID, with environmental destruction, with war still, um, with misogyny. Uh, I mean, so, um, but it's a generalizable concern, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want there to be misogyny in the world. Period. It's not only because of my granddaughters, but it's a terrible plague that harms women in particular, but also harms us from being fully human. So yeah, so a worry and concern. Hey.
So McLuhan learned from an artist that, or a poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. And the word artist means literature, professors, painters, poets. So, it's just this general thing.
Mhm.
Artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so that we can learn how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions.
Yeah, yeah,
So there's hidden psychic effects of Facebook or the internet, and
right.
we just embrace it, and we don't really know how it's changing us, but there are ways to uncover the hidden psychic effects. So this was one of McLuhan's main questions, and I asked you, why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of utilitarian perspective. Like, we have this tool, let's use it, let's not think about what are the ultimate consequences. It's like one sociologist once said, Americans operate on the toilet assumption. If you just flush things away, you're never going to have to worry about it anymore. But of course you have to worry downstream. You have to see what's going on, what the effects are. And I think it's people sometimes don't have the time to do that. They have other concerns or worries that they have to contend with. And so having to deal with, you might call it the psychic effects, or having to deal with the ramifications or consequences of the use of these technologies, that sometimes, the artists will try to scream about it. People would just as soon turn off and use it in a utilitarian way. Let's not think about it.
Really well put. Again, I love your choice of words. They're really articulate and communicating a lot to me, Fran. And it really evoked what Americans also do, is just jiggle the handle.
I've been, I've also been there on that too.
Are you more afraid? Oh, wait, another artist question. Do artists have a moral obligation?
This is one of those difficult questions, right? And I'd have to say that um, I come down. I think it was Tolstoy who talked about this as artists who, that art does have to have a moral role to play, and it's not just Tolstoy. It has a long history, obviously, right? Um, uh, but there are times when, because of what a painter does, or because what a musician does, or a poet does, just the simple act of putting it together and providing people with some pleasure at what they see, it then doesn't need to convey a moral purpose. So,
Really
in a
well.
sense, the difference is between art as an aesthetic experience, right? And art as a moral experience. I think it can do both.
Yeah.
I think the great art often does both,
Yeah.
but it shouldn't be reduced to providing that kind of heavy-handed moral lesson.
Totally. Picasso's painting Guernica, finishing up in his studio in Paris in this German government officials touring all the art studios. And he walks in and he looks at the painting and he says to Picasso, "Did you do that?" And Picasso said, "No, you did."
It's great.
Are you more afraid of new ideas or old ideas?
Oh, wow. New ideas based on old ideas. And let me explicate that a little bit. The old idea of nationalism, right? So you can find a way, governments often do, of translating what are these tribal notions of community based upon one's connection to a nation into something which you know is a is kind of a what could you call it, a spectacle of the notion, right? And so people can be engaged with the spectacle and not realize that this is part of the nation state military industrial complex. So the flyovers, for example, right, at you know in when you're attending a sporting event, or even better, right, the pledge of the use of the national anthem at football games or baseball games, right? And so when somebody like Colin Kaepernick takes the knee in order to draw attention to what what was happening to young black kids being shot by police, people got very upset, saying he was unpatriotic. Well, how did that ever get introduced, and why? The idea of having, the national anthem. Well, it was partly because this was something that was being promoted by the Pentagon for the NFL to do. So here's that sense of, here's an old idea, right? What a great, glorious thing it is to die for your country. That lie, I think it was, the First World War poet who talked about that, who died in that war. And it's something which is, the spectacle is created in a way to bind you to what is an old idea and to make you less open to the idea that, in fact, we are a human community and we need to think beyond these borders.
That question is rooted in two quotes, but the second one sort of is a flip. It's Charles Kettering who invented the intermittent windshield wiper. He said, "People are very open-minded about new things, just as long as they're like the old ones." Well,
That's great.
The roots of my question is exactly how you explained it. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
Now this is something that I've spent a little thought on, so it doesn't catch me. So Piaget, the great childhood psychologist, talks about the way in which our early experiences are, when children do not yet have full language development, that these images are very strong. And Oliver Sacks goes on to talk about that too, the experience which we think we've actually even had. So I am convinced, because what happens is people tell you these stories over and over, and you get this image, and then the image becomes grafted onto your brain, and it seems very real. So my parents used to tell me about how I was brought home from where I was born in Joplin, Missouri, on the train by my mother when I was 6 months old. And I swear, I think I somehow have a memory. It could have been totally constructed on the basis of all those expressions later on, of making that trip. And I think what other neuroscientists talk about in particular is, we have these what are sometimes called flashbulb memories. that can happen at very young age because of a traumatic event. And something, unfortunately, as horrific as war, when you're very young and don't even have the language yet to describe what's going on, those sorts of things. And I worry about, whether it was a young child in Afghanistan under American bombs or a young child in the Ukraine under Russian bombs, what that is going to be retained and how that trauma is going to be embedded mentally so it becomes that kind of flashbulb memory.
Yeah. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Well, it can be, obviously can be both, right? In the
Yeah.
sense that we have to remember certain things. And I'm deep in rereading a lot of literature of the Holocaust. And, those are things that people have found different ways of memorializing, and the need to keep those memories, which will soon disappear from the actual witnesses. But when you go around a city like Berlin and you see these stones in the ground of people in houses who were taken away, German Jews who were taken away, that's a way that you memorialize, and you create the possibility of a historical memory going beyond just the witness.
Yeah. Tell me, please, someone within your immediate family who was a role model, and then outside your immediate family, they had an impact on you. Just briefly, what was that impact?
I would say that at my earliest young age, it was my Zadie, who died, however, when I was my grandfather, who died. That's the Yiddish word for
Yeah.
grandfather, who died when I was only 10. And he was a barber. And he used to take me down and give me my haircuts. We'd go down to the basement of this house. And I just remember it was such a tender moment. And he was such a kind man.
Wow.
And I just think of, and it was such a tactile thing. I just think that being able to somehow impart to my grandkids through holding them and loving them and conveying that kind of emotion, that's another way that we potentially can become role models, as long as you also manifest that as part of how you live through the world. So yeah, I think it's not so much that he was a role model per se, but I think he created a feeling of what it means to be a mensch.
It's
Another
beautiful.
Yiddish word.
Yeah, I know it's really beautiful, because I was going to say, someone a couple months ago, I says, "What do you do when language breaks down?" He goes, "Group hug." I mean, we're intellectuals. We could gab and talk and use all these words, but for you to say one of these amazing things was just the tactility of your grandpa, that's really beautiful, because it shows you that full perspective
Yeah.
in getting in touch with all your senses. So, Fran, outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact, and what was that impact?
All right. So I always say that I have a limited number of heroes, and one was Roberto Clemente.
Wow, how cool. And what'd you get from him?
Okay. So, first of all, as a young kid growing up in Pittsburgh and loving playing baseball, as a right fielder, I styled everything I could on what Roberto Clemente did, standing back in standing toward the back of the batter's box, trying to develop an arm that couldn't be anywhere near what this guy had. And then ultimately carrying yourself as a proud human being who was aware of what your accomplishments were without bragging about it. Right.
Wow.
And then ultimately also, as you know, he died in a plane crash delivering medical equipment to people in Nicaragua who had just suffered through a horrible earthquake. And so,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, everything about that, who he was, it was, I mean, there are obviously lots of people who politically influenced me, and teachers who I had, um, but
But you
I
got
think,
the question. You understood the question because we're going to get into those other means. But I have to do a quick divert. What do you think of Willie Mays?
oh, another great baseball player. I mean,
What year were you born?
I was born 1945.
Wow. Okay, so the next question is, you told us you were raised a particular religion. Do you pray?
No, I'm an atheist. So I don't believe in praying. What I believe in is doing things that indicate that I have a conscience and that I want to witness solidarity, that I want to create solidarity. So everything from, you know, uh, being in Witness for Peace, going down to Nicaragua in 1984 during the Contra War, standing on the border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua when the Contras were in Costa Rica, and I mean, those sorts of things where where you do it's an article of faith in some
Yeah.
respects, right? It has some of the qualities that prayer has. You're not appealing to an outside force necessarily. You're appealing to people's conscience, hopefully, but you realize that you might not. What you are trying to do may not reach the very people who can make changes to change the particular policy, let's say. So therefore, it becomes a kind of article of faith. It's
Yeah.
like Camus, and the myth of Sisyphus. We're condemned to roll this boulder up a hill and never get to the top. And the sense is that you do an act which may seem on one hand not to have an immediate impact, but you hope that it's going to have some kind of resonance, so
Yeah.
that it will live beyond just that moment.
Key word for us, resident. So, if God does exist, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
I reject the question.
Hey, I love when people ask, this is very good. Like, all my more questions, a couple months ago, a woman says, the word more in your question doesn't function. See, I want to constantly work at the questions and allow people to say, don't know, pass. I don't encourage pass, but I refuse to answer questions perfect. Okay. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't think that evil is some kind of psychic force in the world, or a metaphysical force. I believe that people embody forms of evil precisely because of how they were conditioned, and uh, the kind of choices they make of communities that they were immersed in. So yeah, I mean,
That's good.
it's
That's
easy to point to evil people,
Yeah.
right? We can point to Hitler, we can point
Yeah.
to any number of evil people, but I think that if you start deconstructing their evil qualities, what you get is the legacy of anti-Semitism, right? Which wasn't just a single person representing it, right? You get the legacy of militarism, the legacies of violence. All of those become embedded then in certain human beings making certain choices, having been conditioned in particular ways.
Exactly. Follow up is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'm going to set up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Another Michigander, Coppola, stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies close. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question, Fran, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you address Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Again, it depends on the level of animosity that we're dealing with, right? If this is an enemy who does not recognize you as another human being, in other words, to go back to the Holocaust and to Hitler, if you are regarded as a subhuman, as as something to be eradicated, it's very difficult then to forgive an enemy. It's very difficult to find, even for you to find the humanity in the enemy. What you have to do is, and this is as Camus says, there are certain limits beyond which you can't go. You have to be able to say, as an ethical human being, this is what I will do. Beyond that, if I go beyond that particular line, what I've done is I violated what I hope are the ethics that I believe are representative of who I am. So, can you ever forgive an enemy? Yeah, I mean, if you've gone through life and you've created, and there's some discord between you and another person, and it turns out that person despises you, I would hope that there are ways that you can find, um, um, being able to get back to acknowledging the common humanity. And by doing that, what you're saying is, this person isn't my enemy. This person may have been somebody in my life who had an animus toward me, right? That's different than being an enemy. So if you have animus, which you can have without dehumanizing another person, and that's a fine line, right? Having animus.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really good, because it's also what Ram Dass said. I'm having a real hard time loving George Bush. And it's like, fill in the blank. I'm having a real hard time loving Putin right now.
That's right. I don't have to. I mean, that's the thing. You don't have to love these people, right? That's what. To acknowledge them as human doesn't mean you have to love them. It just means that they also exhibit all of the emotions, maybe in some ways much more constricted, and in some ways much more adult, and in some ways much more sclerotic than other human beings who operate on the basis of love and solidarity.
Boy, I love you repeating solidarity. That is such a powerful word. And James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?
I love that quote.
Yeah.
I love that quote. I'll tell you why. Because I was fortunate enough to live in Venice, Italy for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I would often go with my daughter on my backpack when she was, my middle daughter, when she was just 1 or 2, and she'd be in the backpack, and we'd walk over to San Marco, and I'd see people walking into the square, and the first thing they'd do is they'd get their camera out, and I'd want to go over. I almost felt like going over and slapping the camera out of their head, and I'd say, look at this, take this in. Don't just, this was constructed in a way that, has a certain kind of power and symmetry and beauty for the human senses to operate. Don't use the instrument to try to record it, artificially.
I really appreciate, because besides being a great talker, you're a great listener. So nobody stops me in the middle when I rattle off these cute quotes before I get to the question. And if you listen closely, there's somewhat of a fine line, but it really evoked, I have to interject, it evokes the great McLuhan line about photography. Exact same thing. The woman is pushing the baby cart down the street, and the guy goes up to the woman and says, "Wow, what a beautiful baby." And the mother goes, "You should see her picture."
That's great. I hadn't seen that by McLuhan. I love that. I love that.
But the follow-up is, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Yeah, I think, again, goes back to your question about the artist, right? If the artist is going to have any impact, what that artist hopes to do is to make people stop and to reflect and to think through what they may just be oblivious to. And so that's why we have art, right? And I think that's why we're looking for ways in which you can retell what people may have lived through and get them to see it in a whole new way.
Yeah. That's also Auden, the poet, said, the mystery of art is that we don't know it if it activates us or pacifies us. So Bertolt Brecht says, I want art that activates you. It's like, well, dude, some art can trance you out, and then eventually that trance will put you into activation.
Right.
So I like Auden saying that's the mystery of art.
Yes.
We want to think, that you can get people inspired to go do something, but it might be more pacifying than activating them. But it's like Sidney Lumet said, all his films are socially conscious, but he says films can't do diddly squat, but it ain't going to keep me from trying.
That's right. Well, and he made one I think of the most brilliant films about the Holocaust, The Pawnbroker.
The Pawnbroker. There you go. See,
I mean, it was, and it was I mean, that moment when Rod Steiger, when he's finally letting these memories flood over him of how brutal the Holocaust was, and he literally puts it, he jabs his hand down onto this, sharp instrument.
Yeah.
And it was, I could feel the pain then. I mean, I literally could feel the pain then.
Yes.
Although at the same time, one of the other ways I think of conveying the extent of the Holocaust was a Czech film, and what it showed me. You walk into this what was a warehouse, and all you saw were violins, shoes, all of the things that had been collected from the people who had been murdered.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, we're really, that's another way you don't have to show bodies coming out of horrific, porn. Holocaust pornography that
I know
people have called it, but to convey what it meant to destroy a civilization, to destroy a culture. Yeah.
Really good, Fran. I'm going to go off a little because we're so deep into this. What was the motive of the cave artist? What's your hunch? Not so much what anthropologists or Herzog or whoever tells us, but your hunch.
Yeah. Initially, I think it was, again, rendering in pictographs what had transpired that other people maybe didn't have the tools to yet convey. So maybe the language was limited in what it meant to stalk a particular animal. And maybe the full force of what it meant to engage in what was a difficult moment for this group. So to put that on the wall was a reminder that this was an enterprise we engaged in together. This was something monumental from our perspective. And this should be memorialized. It's like,
Yes. You know, it also evokes the McLuhan line, the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can.
that's right. Yeah.
Which,
No,
which
that's,
which
yeah,
leads into your basically walk me through just briefly your tipping points for your career moves. Because I mean, basically, I would say you tell me you're a professor, historian, and author. That's one of your careers. The other one is you're a peace activist.
right.
So I don't know if you do other creative things. Oh, you wrote a novel. So you're a writer. I mean,
Right.
writing. So let's just take writing first off. What first, you're growing up a reader, what first said, I can do this? What was the tipping point to say, I can be a writer? Did you go to college and pursue writing? Tell us about that.
No, I think that when I was in elementary school, when I was in middle school, um, it occurred to me that there were certain things going on, and you may remember this too. We had what were called retention drills, the fear of the atomic bomb being dropped on us, and I think that that had a profound impact on just on me, on our generation, right? And so I always had a hard time thinking about, well, what's the future going to bring? What future? I'm not sure how far I can think into the future. So one of the first things I remember writing beyond assignments, right, for school, was a poem about war where I used some kind of metaphors. And I thought, wow, you know what? I don't have to say fuck war, excuse me, for I, don't, I can write a line which uses the idea of what it means to uh, engage in war through the use of metaphors. And so that was a moment in which I understood that language could be used creatively, and I could think through what it meant to write. Now, what happened eventually is I became overeducated in the way in which you get socialized into being an intellectual, going to graduate school, and that's not the only way it can happen, but that certainly happens to me. And so I was very concerned about, how am I going to analyze things? How can I write in ways that immediately connects to a particular issue or topic? And so, practically everything I wrote then got to be nonfiction, and in which I tried to analyze a particular issue, provide a historical narrative to how white supremacy had developed, as the last book, a collection of essays about weaponized whiteness, or how imperialism operated, dying empire. I mean, all of these things were, to me, were ways of trying to provide accessible language to a reader who wouldn't be bogged down in mere academic jargon. So I guess I look at myself, I talk, and this may be somewhat arrogant, is I like to think of myself as a public intellectual in a minor way, not like Chomsky, not like these other people, but I try to create in the work that I do ways of highlighting what I believe are important issues that people can reflect upon in critical ways.
Well, this is good, but I'm just saying, were you reading? So you're studying history and
Yes.
journalism throughout college?
No, not journalism. I'm studying
History.
history.
Okay.
History was I mean, if you believe it or not, I think I won and when I was in fifth grade, a Daughters of the American Revolution. Boy, were they going to rue that later. An award because that's what I loved. I was a
Right.
history buff. I was a history major. When I went to grad school, it was in American studies, focused mostly on history, but not exclusively, on literature also, and on popular culture.
But
So
were there like a couple, I'm just guessing, George Seldes and I.F. Stone, were there a couple people you read that go, that's what I want to do? Were there a couple historians that made you shift from, I'm not just going to be an intellectual historian academic, I want to be a public intellectual? Anybody who...
yeah. Well, one of them was Stoughton Lynd. And Stoughton had been a historian of the American Revolution, but he had also been very active in setting up the helping with the freedom schools during the SNCC days, the Student for Nonviolent.
Good. Yeah.
And during the mid '60s. So Stoughton Lynd was my idea of, even though it may have not been fully congealed, my idea of a public intellectual, and he's continued that role right through his life, and thank goodness he's still hanging in there.
Perfect. So a screenwriting teacher told me great art or great film, great literature, great public intellectual books is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your writing process? And I know, you've written lots of books, but just the general feeling.
Yeah, I think one of the best criticisms I got of the novel, because I'm not a fiction writer, was that I was telling too much and not showing enough.
Yeah.
And so, and I was doing it in a way that brought attention to the writing that I shouldn't, because I like wordplay. Yeah. That's why I was a big Soupy Sales fan.
Yeah.
I like wordplay, and I couldn't avoid it. And there's certain tricks that I like to that I did in my badly baldly constructed novel. But so
but all your
tell
other,
me again.
But all your other books, it's both. You just blend this to it. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much other than your novel, most of your historic books, and I'll plug, here's your great book on Soupy Sales.
Thank you.
Amazing book that brought us together. I mean, my sister sent me this and I was just like, oh my God, this is Godhead. Apple, turn over. Apple, turn over. But, how much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your book?
Okay. That's a really good question, because I have written hundreds of little, what are essentially op-ed pieces, are now, starting with Common Dreams and Counterpunch and all these online places where I pretty much can write almost in my sleep, 1,000-word essay that tries to make some critical political points, does it in a way which is somewhat sophisticated, not crude, somewhat historically rooted. Um, so, you know, I very much, when I'm sitting down to write those sorts of things, I'm very aware of my audience. When I'm just writing a research piece, even like the Soupy Sales book, I have no idea who's going to read it, and I'm just doing it to satisfy what task I've set
Yeah.
before me.
Yeah. Look at this is really good. McLuhan says that I really appreciate it, Fran. McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness.
Right.
So knife and fork extends our teeth, shutter and a camera extends our eyelid. What does the writing utensil extend for you? What humanness? Whether it's a keyboard or a pen.
Yeah. Um, if I may just do a preface to this, because that's a great question, Jerry. Um, for a long time, I wrote in longhand. I wrote on I I wrote on notepads, and in fact, I would go in even 5, 7 years ago. I would go into the library when people had their laptops and everything. I would go into archives, and I had my 3x5 note cards, and I'd be handwriting this stuff out, real old school, because again, to me, that pen was an extension of my thinking,
Yeah.
more so than the keyboard.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because in my earliest efforts of learning how to formulate thoughts, it came through the pen.
Yeah.
And therefore, I still would use that. And there are times when I still go back and try to construct arguments and make outlines with using a pen, using an graph paper.
Beautiful. What's the difference? Let's go political a little. What's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
Oh, okay. So rights should be enumerated in a way, as I think the Universal Declaration of Rights does, enumerated in a way so that they cover the largest breadth of humanity, and that they provide for justice, they provide for peace, they provide for certain economic necessities. And that's what I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is all about. Um, Responsibilities come when those of us who have more privileges have to find ways of guaranteeing those rights for people who don't have the same privileges that we have. It doesn't mean they're incapable of rising up, as we've seen with the Zapatistas, in Mexico, as poor people around the world, rising up. They don't, it doesn't require having a middle class status to do that. But I certainly think those of us who are in relatively privileged positions, whether it's because of, our skin color, our gender, our educational level, our economic level, that we have the responsibility of trying to expand the rights so that it does cover all of humanity.
Very good, friend. What's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Now this is because I've been reading more Camus recently and writing about Camus. Rebellion and the act of being a rebel is an act of what Camus calls, and I love this term, altruistic individualism. In other words, it's something that you as an individual can do, but you do that with a sense of your connection, your solidarity again, right? So tell me that question one more time.
What's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Okay.
Yeah, that was good. You covered rebellion really well.
Yeah. And I
Good.
think, in its simplest terms, like, revolution is overturning a system.
Yeah,
And I like to think that, it doesn't always mean that that system is oppressive. There's a famous um, uh, discussion of what a scientific revolution was. So
yeah,
that the way of seeing the Earth as the center of the universe was an outmoded way of understanding how the universe operated. And that was part of the scientific revolution, right? So, but in the generic sense, it was overturning an old way of operating in the world, an old pattern of thinking. And it doesn't necessarily involve violence. And I think
yeah,
that's what sometimes people right away believe, that revolution requires um, violence.
does.
And I
Totally,
don't think that's the case.
totally agree. And here's another one. Utah Phillips, great folk singing
Love him.
activist. He says, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make rules?
I love that. I love that quote. Having seen Utah Phillips on a number of occasions, I can really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Well,
And he was,
one really quick, one hardcore anarchist historian said that's not true, but it's you got to understand Utah was playful, but it is a way. It's not so much I want to talk about anarchy, it's more I want to talk who's entitled to make the rules. But I
yeah,
just set it up with this quick quirky quote, so go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. I mean, I think the only people who should be entitled, here I'm going to should on people, right? The only people who should be entitled to make those rules are people who are prepared to engage the largest number of people um, in deciding what is right and just for everyone. And
Yeah,
that's a sort of playing out of, certain kinds of philosophical positions about, the greatest number, the greatest good for the greatest number sort of approach, or
yeah,
maximizing the Kant's categorical imperative. I'm trying not to be too didactic and
yeah.
academic in this stuff, but
But it's called, is that also called direct democracy?
it is.
Yeah.
It's something I believe in. I hope to see accomplish something, but I I think we keep on setting ourselves back in so many ways.
Yeah. How can we keep governments from going to war?
Oh man. This is an interesting thing. Einstein. I did a little course on Einstein recently for our temple, and it was a conversation about Einstein's politics. And Einstein, before 1932, was very much a pacifist. He saw himself as sort of a situational pacifist. But he said, and this became a meme. We didn't call it a meme back then. But he said, look, if 10%, if only 10% of the people said, I will not allow myself to be conscripted, I will not be cannon fodder, I will not be an instrument of the state to make war on other people. 10% of the people did that, we could maybe, begin to end war. 32, 33, Hitler comes to power. Einstein looks at what's happening and says, I can't say that anymore. I can't tell people not to have to defend themselves and not to commit to trying to stop this madness. Um, so in some respects, what we always have to engage in, or at least I'll speak for myself, right? What I did as a draft resistor, what I thought I was acting on during the Vietnam War, was saying, no, I'm not going to accept this privileged position of a student deferment, first of all, because it isn't granted to everybody. And secondly, I'm not going to be an instrument of engaging in war against the people of Vietnam. Um, So I think that I think really it's excuse me. Sometimes I get lost in the digressions. So again, it's always good to be reminded, Jerry, of where we are in the conversation.
Oh, you're doing great. It was basically how do we stop how do we stop governments from going to war? And
Yeah.
you sussed it out well. Let's move on because we only got
Okay.
about 15 more minutes. And
Okay.
this has really been beautiful. I appreciate it. And again, it's another stupid question, but just in general, what's more important, conviction or compromise?
In one's political life, conviction. In one's personal relationships, compromised.
Dude, that is a great way to differentiate. Is perception reality?
Sure, Gestalt therapist and Gestalt psychologist would certainly say perception can establish that reality.
That's when I asked my one friend, he says, "That's all you got."
No, what we have is the ability to understand that whatever perceptual field you're part of may be artificially constructed.
Yeah.
So you can step back in a way and say, no, I don't accept how this is artificially constructed for me. So the perception that most, the perception that immediately hits me isn't the one that I'm going to want to consider in the
So,
long run.
Fran, yeah. So, Fran, in the years you've been a public intellectual, writing books, professor, historian, tell me one major element that's changed and one major element that stayed the same.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously the way of conveying information has changed. When I started out, we were uh, still reading books, still talking about books in class, still writing papers about it, still engaging in conversations. Um, and over the 40 years, actually almost 50 years of involved in teaching, um, that changed a lot. And it didn't necessarily change for the better. Certainly, a lot of people talked about, well, um, teaching online means that you could democratize the classroom and more people could participate and could feel like they weren't. And there's research out there that suggests that. On the other hand, um, it I saw it as a situation where um, to try to set before people, okay, let's read War and Peace, 1,000-page book. And they're going, are you crazy? I'm not reading a 1,000-page book. I mean, I think that changed for the worse.
Yeah.
Okay. I think what may have changed for the better is the sense that by the end of my career, and this Pablo Freire identified early on, there's a difference between banking education, right, and dialogical education. The idea, or as some feminist linguists talk, the difference between rapport talk and report talk, right? So what we're trying to do is, in the Freirean sense, is engage in dialogue and
Yeah.
thinking, how do you pose questions so that you, and I guess it's the old Socratic method too, how do you pose questions so that people feel engaged in constructing further questions and other arguments. So it's not like you go into a class and deliver a lecture. I mean, you can
Yeah.
do that. There's some moments where having 15 minutes of, here's some information I'd like you to think about. But then the conversation and the reflection has to be dialogical. And I think over the years, it took me time to learn how to do that, and took me, and I think that in some ways, um, students becoming more insistent, people asking more questions, people feeling like they have a right to be part of a discussion rather than just to be passive. It was something that changed over those years that I think was for the better.
Really well put, Fran. And it really it reminded me of McLuhan's line, put it very simply. He says, the modern person is running around going, I've got the answers, but what are the questions?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
And he also said in 57, and I'm going to read you the whole quote because I could reduce it, but you will get some of the middle part. It's misleading to suppose there's any basic difference between education and entertainment.
Mm.
This distinction merely relieves people of the responsibility of looking into the matter. It's like setting up the distinction between didactic and lyric poetry on the ground that one teaches and the other one pleases. However, it's always been true that whatever pleases teaches more effectively. Now, I think there's a lot to go into, but the key is those last few words. Is that true? Whatever pleases teaches more effectively. And what does effectively mean? So you can go anywhere with that.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think that what I try to do, in my classes, and I still try to think about ways of doing that, is providing some, maybe using some music, using some literature, using some ways of film, using some ways to stimulate and, dare I say, entertain people, at the same time it becoming a platform into education.
Yeah.
So I think that I've had and I've tried to avoid, although in the early years I wasn't particularly good at it, of being this really didactic presenter of information, right? And learning how to make engaging people sometimes means finding ways of entertaining them.
Yeah. No, it was good. You handled it well. And Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
A weakness that I turned into a strength.
Yeah.
I'm still living with a lot of those weaknesses and haven't been able to find the key to making it a strength. Maybe I need to do more Feldenkrais work.
But I mean, just in general, because you are an amazing human being in my, because you can actually articulate feelings and thinking. And, just you saying that about your grandfather, you didn't say, it was some high intellectual. You know that to reach your students, it wasn't just read War and Peace, that's it.
Yeah.
It was like, hey, I'm aware. You have what I call as a high awareness level.
Thank you.
So I'm just saying, just in general, some weakness that you've turned into a strength,
Yeah. That's another good question. I think I have sometimes a tendency, and you probably have seen it as well other people, to digress in ways that is Talmudic, to use an expression, right?
Nice.
So that I, there's a text upon a text, and I'm thinking of this thought as upon a thought. But I realized that if the digression helps, sometimes it gets lost, so that it's almost like it's a solipsistic act, right? You're just in your own mind, and that's been a problem, right? I've been in my own head too often in ways that I think is a weakness, both for my emotional intelligence, but also for being able to convey information and convey um, deeply held convictions, to use another good term, to other people. So sometimes, if the digression is a way of rooting it in a personal experience, then that weakness of digressing and being discursive and you know making loops, sometimes that I can tap into something that be it may allow me to connect with an audience in a better way.
Yeah, it's almost stream of consciousness, and that's what we want. We want to go down all these side roads, because that's what Joyce's main thing was. How do you find epiphany in everydayness?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you're making all these connections all day, and you can have an epiphany. But the Talmudic word you brought up was good, because I think I read this once and I forgot about it, and you helped me recall it. Is in studying the Talmud, they would say the assignment was come up with a question that's never been asked. Yeah, have you ever heard that?
No, but I can't
But
imagine. It's like,
like, what an assignment! Like, come up, and this is a question I got from Rich Feldman, which I love. Is in its follow up for this is, what question remains unresolved for you? Now, I
yeah,
know there's probably a lot, but just one major question that remains unresolved for you.
I think it is, how do I find a way of living in the world with hope?
Yeah. High
And
aspirations, dude. That is,
I mean,
yeah, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, it's um, there's so many things that seem um, war,
Yeah.
poverty, the problem of refugees. I mean, there's so many things that I seem at a certain point like where it's seemingly so intractable. How do we find our way to a resolution that's going to demonstrate our sense of compassion and justice, and so yeah.
Now that's
uh,
beautiful. My friend has the flip. She's a political activist, and she says hope is for sissies. That's like, I understand what she's saying, but I was raised, power of positive thinking and all that. But I think this is a Yiddish saying I heard on CBS Sunday Morning the other day, and I think I got it right. I'd love to hear you. If you must, you can.
if you
Is
must, you
that
can. I don't know.
is
I don't
is
know
that?
how one.
But how did, just the idea? What if you must, you can? How do you react to that?
If you must, you can. If this is something that is part, to go back to loop back to something, if this is a conviction, right? It's a conviction that you want to see realized. Um, then to make it realizable, you have to do it.
Yeah,
You have to put it into effect. So
yeah.
it's a must into a can.
It's like that woman who was a Russian news lady or newswoman. And did you see her? She
Yeah, that
gives
was great.
news with the
Yeah.
poster, no war. I mean, that to me, that just made me weep today. It's like, this is unreal. And then she did her little YouTube video before, and she's all nice in her Zoom and saying, I had to do this. It's like, boy, they're going to disappear her really fast, it seems. Anyways,
Yeah.
Grant, I asked for 90 minutes. Can you go another 10?
Sure.
Oh, great. Okay. Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
Yeah, I was just reading something about that the other day, and I'm not going to try to recreate that. Anger can be a productive emotion when you are trying to realize solidarity. Get back to
Wow, that is so concise. You are a wordsmith supreme. So Jonathan Swift, and this is about satire and destruction. Like, I'll just cut to the chase. I asked my friend, can satire be destructive? We all know most people go, yes. If you do a cartoon in a certain country and they kill you, death is destructive. Well, my one friend who wrote comedy for Robin Williams says, "Can satire be destructive?" He says, "That's the job of satire."
exactly.
You understand it. So especially, being such a scholar in, again, promoting this guy in an amazing book, and what a subversive,
Yeah.
the dude was really subversive for us, and we all turned out okay. I mean, and so Jonathan Swift compared satire to a mirror in which people could see every face but their own. So maybe just talk about satire as a historian and as a political activist. Any
Yeah.
comment?
There are a series of articles that I wrote, which I like to think are satirical pieces, including a piece that was in this other book that I put together called Bush League Spectacles. Um, and it's about, it was about mad cow disease, but it takes place on a farm with cows talking to each other. It's a little bit like Animal Farm, right? I mean, but a really, it's as if Soupy Sales had written Animal Farm instead of George Orwell.
That's
Um,
good.
so yeah, so uh, satire. Frame the question again so I can get
Well,
back.
I would usually just say, can satire be destructive? But I could just say, what is the function of satire as a political activist or as an educator?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, and it goes back to that question you asked, and the quote from McLuhan again. So, entertainment and education.
Yeah.
So you can write satire in a way that pokes fun, particularly at people in power, um, and does so in a way that people get a laugh out of. Um, and at the same time, they go, "Oh yeah, like why should that be?"
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's a great Frank Zappa line where he sings like, there's you're talking about the Nazis in your town. You better go home and check yourself. You might think we're singing about somebody else.
Yeah,
That's the
call any vegetable.
that's what caused matriarchy.
um, I think the power of birth.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read Marilyn French, there was a book she wrote years and years ago um, called Beyond Power, which I actually used in class, and I thought it was a really excellent book. But she does, not in the, not necessarily always grounded in the, up to date research, but I certainly think that capacity of birth, the knowing that that women, to be simplistic, and that the process of giving birth meant also that women bled as a function of who they were, meant that they didn't have to go out and make other people bleed for them to prove their value. It's like, so male fantasies and male and toxic masculinity before it was, even framed that way. I think is also is has a foundation often of, in simplistic terms, of the fact that uh, men sometimes don't always understand their own mortality and the need to be humble about that mortality.
Boy, Fran, you must have ESP. The next question is, can you forget to die?
You forget to die. Um, wow. I understand. Can you forget about death? Right, which is a different formulation of the question.
It
But
is
can
very
you forget to die? That's got me stumped.
really good. Let's see. Again, you're helping me. It's the question of the whole series is how do we reword these questions? How do we suss out the question?
Yeah.
It's not so much, but um, how do you find peace of mind?
Oh, there are certain things. I think when I'll give you a great example that is also, um, I had the good fortune and bad fortune in another way, but good fortune to be in Mexico recently, and I would get up right before the sun would come up. And one day, and this is indicative of where I can find peace of mind, is I went down to the beach and there was a full moon, and the full moon was on the west and the sun was rising in the east. And that moment of just being there, seeing the magnificent um, testimony to the natural world. Now, all of that brought me down quickly when I was stung by a stingray in that same beach. So, that's the dialectic at work, right? The moment of peace of
That's
mind.
perfect. I
The
used
moment of
to
peace.
have that. Yeah, I used to have that question, but it's so evident. Are
Well,
the
can I do another riff on that quickly,
oh
Jerry?
sure, but let me
Okay.
just say, it's like, are the laws of nature cruel? And
Yeah.
people are
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, you know what I'm saying, but go ahead,
Yeah.
riff
Yeah.
on it."
No, I want to do this is one of my favorite little stories too. So I was on the Isle of Skye. Again, another privileged thing that I could do. I was on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, off the coast of Scotland. And it was in August. It was an overcast day, but I decided I'm going to climb up this highest mountain and just get the vista from the mountain. And it was spectacular. And, I just sat there for a couple of minutes and then I thought, well, I need to take a couple of pictures after fully, spending the time with it. And I'm taking a couple of pictures. All the time the lens cap was on. I only learned that later. And then this big cloud rolls over and it starts raining. I mean, it's just pouring down on me. And I wasn't prepared. I'm running down the hill, and I'm getting soaked. And the little B&B that I was staying in was like a mile away or something. And this car happens by and I wave it down. And it's two locals, husband and a wife. And he stops and picks me up. And I thank him profusely. And he asked me where I'm going. And I mentioned it. And I said, well, I said, this, I got to say that the Isle of Skye, that amazing scenery. And he said, turns to me and he says, you cannot eat the scenery. So just reminded again that, there's a struggle going on.
Yeah.
It's not, you can find peace of mind in a variety of ways. I can be with my granddaughters, telling them stories that I would then later turn into a children's book that I wrote for them. And
Nice.
that's the sort of thing, that relieves me of the burdens of worrying about what else is going on in the world, because it's so immediate, that kind of connection that you have grandkids and with kids in general.
Yeah.
So that's a form of peace of mind, as well as taking a moment to realize the beauty of the world.
Beautiful. Well put. Just a few more. If you were walking down the street today, Fran, what would you say to your 12-year-old self? You meet your 12-year-old self on the street. Today, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Is that all the clothes you have on? You don't even have a jacket. For God's sakes. What are you walking around? It's 40 degrees out. You're walking around in short sleeves? Are you an idiot?
That is a great answer. Very unique, too. You should hear. Which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
I'm an over guy.
All right. Why?
I'll tell you, I can see it in front of me.
Yeah.
I can see how to tear it.
Yeah. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Wow. Something good I never had, but I never wanted. Let me preface this by saying my wife is an amazing cook. But there are times when, and I cook too. But there are times when she feels like, oh, I've done enough cooking for now. So I wouldn't mind having this is pretty petty. Wouldn't mind having a cook.
No, that's good.
I wouldn't want it because I didn't want to burden the person with having to do these things for me,
No, but that's a good answer. It's good. You never had it and you never want it. It's very, because the answer I get the most is fame, money, and heroin.
Yeah.
That's what I get the most. Okay. Really brief, 5 Alan Watts questions in like a couple words, just off the top of your head. Who started it all?
Who started it? What is the it? I can't. Can I even ask
No,
a question?
you answered a question with the question, but the it again is whatever context you want to put it
in. Who started it all? Wow. First person who came out of Africa.
Are we going to make it?
I don't know. I hope so.
Where do we put it?
In some place that everybody can share.
Who's cleaning it up?
All of us need to be cleaning up.
Is it serious?
It's got to have some laughter to it.
You are great. Here's a couple more and we're out of here. Thank you so much. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And someone threw a bag.
Time out. Time out. Time out. What is this? This reminds me of that film by that great Italian woman filmmaker about being in the death camps when people jump into the shit, right, to commit suicide. I don't even want to hear the question.
You don't even let me finish the question. That is brilliant, dude. Because an altar cocker taught me that question, and it's really the metaphor for life. But that's fine. I'll respect that. So Thornton Wilder, the great playwright, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret; it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time.
Wow.
Fran, you've laid your cards on the table for more than an hour and a half. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this, but what's it really all about for you?
What's it really all about for me? If I can find a way to manifest my love to the people around me and to people who are strangers to me.
Wow. Where'd you get that, Fran? More from how your parents raised you or on your own?
I think it's a combination of who was around me growing up, and what I've gone through, and other people who have been inspiring, who've inspired me, who have a greater capacity than I do, a greater ability to manifest their compassion. I think that's who's taught me.
Yeah, it's like Umberto Eco said it so well. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we can actually maybe look farther than them, because we're up there,
Right.
or aspire to look
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Wow. I think I think the I think I know this with my oldest granddaughter. I know with Greta Thunberg and others that generation really feels in a very powerful way viscerally connected to having a habitable planet and a
Yeah.
sustainable existence. And that cultural shift of being able to think not only beyond borders, right? So beyond the nation state, but thinking beyond what our species has been up to now, wasting and befouling our environment. Being able to think beyond that for that generation, that cultural shift is to be rather than to have, is another way of putting
Yeah.
it, right?
Well, it's like we got to give kudos to Rachel Carson in
Sure,
1962, Silent Spring. I
sure,
mean, this was putting it into our lexicon way back then. Thank God.
absolutely.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so I want to give a shout out to my sister Janice Fialka for sending me this book, The Soupy Sales, The Detroit Experience, Manufacturing a Television Personality. What a book. It really connected us. And I appreciate you just having this time with me, Fran, because
Thank you, Jerry. This was a
yeah,
wonderful surprise. I actually had no idea what I was getting into, and I
well,
must say, you've really both enlightened me and challenged me, and so
yeah,
it's been a
well,
fun time.
it's been a fun time for me and I learned a lot, but there's one more question. But I just wanted to say you really got it in, and I encourage people to pursue all your other books. You're not just about Soupy sales. You're a lot of deeper stuff than that.
Yeah.
Although Soupy's pretty dang good.
Well,
Just to
in
think,
fact, the reason that I wrote that book is to get away from writing about war,
yeah,
imperialism, racism. And
but I think it's in here, but I was curious. Do you know the only footage of Clifford Brown,
right,
one of the great, is from Soupy Sales, and
that's right.
that's an amazing phenomenon.
Yeah, right. I talk about that and the fact
Yeah,
that Ken Burns used that in his PBS jazz series.
yeah,
And that was taken like a few weeks or months before Clifford died in that tragic
right.
automobile accident in his mid 20s. An
That's it.
incredibly amazing trumpet player.
Yep.
Just
And so the last question, I hope our conversation goes on forever and ever, Fran. Thank you so much. What gives you the most optimism?
my grandkids.
That
I
is the
gotta say,
answer. That's the answer I get the most. Youth, you know. So stay young. And Fran, thank you
thank
so
you.
much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to hit the end button, but I hope it just starts.
All right. So I leave the studio now too?
That's it. Bye.
All right.